She was erased from every drawing room for 3 years, until the Duke confessed the truth of his cowardice. London, 1824. Evening light filtered through the crystal chandeliers of Pemberton House when Lisa J. Otten heard her name spoken with a recognition that should not exist. Not by the servants arranging champagne flutes, not by the debutantes rehearsing their curtsies, but by a voice that belonged to parliaments and ancestral estates, not to women who'd been publicly branded as regrettable lapses in judgment. Lisa J. Otten. The syllables cut through 6 years of deliberate forgetting like a diamond through silk. The name society had been instructed to strike from every guest list, every conversation, every memory of who once mattered. At 28, she knew which European ports offered the finest raw silk, which merchants in Lyon would honor contracts when English lords defaulted, which morning she'd woken in a rented room on the continent with nothing but a broken heart and a bolt of fabric that would become an empire. But she had never heard her name, her real name, not that unfortunate woman or the physician's daughter, spoken by London's elite as though she still had the right to exist in their world. She stood at the top of Pemberton's grand staircase, her fingers resting lightly on the balustrade, her posture betraying none of the war beneath her golden gown. Through the open doors below, the prosperous heart of London society swirled in orchestrated splendor, a world populated by people who belonged somewhere, whose attachments were celebrated rather than concealed, whose lovers claimed them even when scandal threatened. Lisa had once belonged to someone. She had been the secret jewel in Duke Julius E. Borges's private world for 3 years, loved in shadowed alcoves and midnight gardens, cherished in whispered promises, then discarded with surgical precision when his mother demanded a more suitable match. A temporary indiscretion, nothing more. His words, delivered before 200 witnesses at the Ashford Musicale, had been designed to save his position and obliterate hers. She was merely the woman who'd been foolish enough to love him, the shadow who'd believed his promises of some day, useful enough to warm his bed, forgettable enough to sacrifice when ambition called. The butler's footsteps echoed across marble, measured and deliberate. He appeared at the base of the staircase, his expression carrying something Lisa hadn't seen directed at her in 6 years. Deference. "There is a gentleman requesting your presence in the Wedgwood drawing-room," he said, and his voice held the careful neutrality of someone navigating a social earthquake. "The Duke of Borges. He asks most urgently for a private audience." Lisa's breath stopped. The Duke. For her. Her heart struck once against her ribs, hard, accusatory, as if she'd committed some unforgivable transgression by daring to return. Then it seemed to halt entirely, suspended in the crystalline silence between the string quartet's movements, because dukes did not request audiences with women they'd publicly destroyed unless desperation had made cowards into supplicants. And no one begged for the woman they'd spent 6 years erasing unless there was a reason that would shatter everything they thought they'd built without her. If you love stories where shamed women reclaim their power, where public humiliation becomes private triumph, and where love demands accountability before forgiveness, stay with Lisa's journey. Your presence here matters. Lisa J. Otten did not know she was worthy of being chosen. She knew only what 3 years as a secret mistress had taught her. That love without social standing was permission, not promise. That the daughter of a country physician might be privately treasured but never publicly claimed. That when a duke whispered, "I love you," in darkness, he meant for now. She grew up in a modest home outside London, learning medicine from her father's practice, reading philosophy by candlelight, discovering she possessed a mind that could calculate profit margins as easily as pulse rates. At 22, she met Julius at a country assembly, a chance encounter that became clandestine meetings, stolen weekends at his hunting lodge, 3 years of being the most important secret he kept. She had no title, no fortune, no confirmation that her devotion registered as anything more than convenience to the man who held her heart. Her only inheritance was the knowledge of how to be grateful for scraps of his time, how not to demand, how not to expect, how not to imagine she deserved the legitimacy other women received without question. Lisa descended the staircase with measured steps, her pulse beating a rhythm foreign to the careful control she'd perfected across 6 years of rebuilding. This wasn't hope. Hope was a luxury for women who hadn't learned that the men they loved could choose ambition over their breaking hearts. Hope was what she'd felt the night before he destroyed her, and she'd vowed never to feel it again. But revenge. Revenge dressed in French silk and backed by a fortune that made his quarterly rents look like pocket change. That she would allow herself to feel just this once. The memory came unbidden as Lisa's hand touched the drawing-room door. Julius in the garden at Thornfield, moonlight caught in his hair, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that made her believe she was sacred to him. 3 years of moments like that one, stolen and perfect, each kiss a promise he swore he'd find a way to keep. She had been 22 when they met at the Michaelmas Assembly. A physician's daughter with ink-stained fingers and opinions about Locke's empiricism that made him laugh with genuine delight. He'd found her in the library while other women danced, and something in his eyes had shifted when she'd challenged his interpretation of social contract theory. "Most women pretend to agree with me," he'd said. She'd smiled. "Most women are more interested in your title than your mind." The affair began 3 weeks later. Clandestine meetings at his hunting lodge, where she'd arrive at dusk and leave before dawn. Weekends when London believed him inspecting his northern estates. He was teaching her to ride his favourite mare, reading poetry aloud while she fell asleep against his shoulder, making love to her with a tenderness that felt like truth. He'd called her his brilliant girl, his Lisa, whispered that she understood him in ways no one born to society ever could. She'd believed him because she'd wanted to, because love at 22 feels like evidence rather than hope. For 3 years, she'd existed in the spaces between his obligations. The third daughter at dinner parties who wouldn't be missed, the woman in the shadowed box at the opera. The name he never spoke in daylight but breathed like prayer in darkness. She'd told herself it was enough, that the private Julius was the real one, that the public performance of duty was the lie he had to maintain until he found courage. The courage never came. Instead came the Ashford musicale, his mother's hand on his arm, Lady Arabella Winthrop's triumphant smile, and Julius's voice carrying across the salon with aristocratic precision. A regrettable lapse in judgment. Nothing more. I'm certain Miss Otten understands these attachments have natural conclusions. She'd stood there in her second-hand gown, watching 3 years of whispered promises incinerate in a single sentence. He hadn't met her eyes. Not once. Not when the dowagers whispered. Not when she'd turned and walked through the crowd that parted like she carried pestilence. Not when she'd climbed into the hired carriage that would take her away from London, away from him, away from the woman who'd been fool enough to believe a duke's pillow talk. Lisa turned the door handle, steadying herself against the echo of her own breaking. She'd been that woman once. She would never be her again. Lisa arrived in Lyon with £43, a trunk of shame, and fury so pure it felt like clarity. The Channel crossing had been rough, her stomach emptying over the rail while English merchants' wives whispered. She'd learned then that shame had a sound, the particular pitch of women's laughter when they witnessed another woman's fall, and felt grateful it wasn't their own. The boarding house smelled of lye soap and old cooking grease. Her room held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the textile district, where merchant wives haggled in rapid French she barely understood. She'd arrived with 2 trunks, one containing modest dresses, the other holding every book Julius had given her. She sold the books first. Locke's essays, Hume's treatise, the leather-bound Paradise Lost he'd inscribed to my brilliant girl. They brought 3 weeks' rent and a single bolt of Lyon silk. The fabric merchant, Madame Beaumont, sharp-eyed and shrewd, had looked at Lisa's reddened eyes and careful French and asked, "You run from a man, or to a future?" Lisa had answered, "Both." The woman laughed, bitter and knowing, and offered her work sorting inventory. Lisa learned the textile trade the way drowning women learn to swim, with desperate focus. She studied weave patterns until her eyes burned, memorized the difference between Lyonnaise silk and Venetian by touch alone, calculated profit margins while other women practiced watercolors. Within a year, she'd turned a kind merchant's advance into 3 looms. Within 2, a small manufactory. By year 4, she had contracts in Amsterdam and a reputation for textiles so fine that Parisian modistes paid premiums for first selection. She learned to speak fluent French with a Lyonnaise accent that carried authority, not charm. She learned to negotiate with men who assumed her gender meant ignorance, then watched their faces change when her calculations proved sharper than their accountants'. She learned that grief, properly channeled, could fuel ambition better than hope ever had. Every contract signed was rebuttal to Julius's dismissal. Every profit margin was proof she'd never needed his world to matter. The empire she built wasn't revenge. Not at first. It was survival, then pride, then finally, inevitably, proof. Proof that the woman he'd discarded had contained multitudes he'd been too blind to see. That the daughter of a country physician possessed a mind sharper than half the peers who'd watched her humiliation with champagne in hand. She became formidable because anything less meant returning to London as what Julius had named her, nothing more than a regrettable lapse. The letter had arrived 3 weeks before the Pemberton ball, delivered by a nervous clerk who'd waited while Lisa read it twice to ensure she hadn't misunderstood the exquisite irony contained within its formal script. Mr. Pemberton, solicitor to the Borges family for 30 years, requested the honor of an audience regarding a matter of utmost delicacy and mutual benefit. The phrasing alone had told her everything. Solicitors didn't speak of mutual benefit unless desperation had made beggars of aristocrats. She'd received him in her Lyon office, surrounded by fabric samples and ledgers that represented everything she'd built from the ashes of his client's cruelty. Pemberton had been a small, precise man with tired eyes and the particular discomfort of someone forced to ask favors from women society had deemed inappropriate. He'd refused her offer of tea, clutched his document case like a shield, and begun speaking before she'd invited him to sit. The Duke of Borges, he'd explained with the careful neutrality of a man paid to deliver catastrophic news, faced financial ruin. The northern estates had failed 3 harvests running. The investments his mother had insisted upon, canals that went nowhere, mining ventures in exhausted quarries, loans to friends who'd promptly fled to the continent, had hemorrhaged capital at rates that would have been comedic if they weren't devastating. The Dowager Duchess's determination to maintain appearances had accelerated the collapse. Creditors circled. The ancestral estate itself faced seizure within the quarter unless someone produced £30,000. Lisa had listened without expression. Her fingers still on the contract she'd been reviewing when he'd arrived. £30,000. She'd earned twice that last year alone. The number that represented Julius's salvation was less than the profit margin on her Amsterdam contracts. "And you've come to me," she'd said finally, "because no one else will loan money to a duke whose credit is ruined and whose mother's judgment is notoriously poor." Pemberton had flinched, but nodded. "You are, Miss Otten, the only person of means who might have personal interest in the Duke's circumstances." Personal interest. As if heartbreak accrued interest like capital. as if the 3 years she'd loved Julius had somehow made her financially responsible for his survival. "The Duke is aware you're soliciting on his behalf?" she'd asked. The solicitor's silence had been answer enough. Julius knew. Of course he knew. He'd probably paced his study while Pemberton drafted the letter, calculating whether the woman he'd discarded possessed enough residual feeling to save him, or enough vindictiveness to watch him drown. Lisa had stood, smoothed her skirts, and smiled with a brightness that made Pemberton grip his case tighter. "Tell His Grace I'll consider his predicament. I return to London next month for the season. Perhaps we'll have opportunity to discuss terms." She'd watched the solicitor's face calculate the implications, that she might help, that she might refuse, that she would certainly make Julius wait, and wonder which mercy she'd choose. Now, standing in the Wedgwood drawing room with Julius before her, all those weeks of calculation crystallized into a single, perfect understanding. He'd cast her out to preserve his position. That position was now hers to grant or destroy. The irony was so pure it almost felt like justice. "Your solicitor mentioned debts," Lisa said, her voice carrying the pleasant tone of someone discussing weather rather than ruin. £30,000, I believe. A considerable sum, though not perhaps as considerable as a woman's reputation. Julius's jaw tightened. "Lisa, please." "Miss Otten," she corrected, soft and lethal. "We're not intimate anymore, Your Grace. Surely you remember. You explained it quite thoroughly to 200 witnesses." Lisa held the textile exhibition in the Clarendon Hotel's Grand Salon, a space she'd secured through strategic deployment of French currency, and the implicit threat that London's elite would soon beg for access to fabrics their dressmakers desperately needed. She'd sent 50 invitations to the women who'd watched her humiliation 6 years prior. Each card engraved with elegant simplicity, "Miss Lisa J. Otten requests the pleasure of your company for a private viewing of Continental Textiles. Exclusive first selection for attendees." 37 came. Not out of forgiveness, but greed. Lady Hartwick arrived first, drawn by rumours that Lisa's silks had made Parisian modistes weep with envy. She swept through the doors with the brittle confidence of someone determined to prove attendance wasn't capitulation. Then stopped short at the sight of fabric draped across every surface like captured moonlight. Lyonnaise silk in shades that had no English names. Damask with weave patterns so intricate they seemed to shift in candlelight. Velvet from Venetian looms that felt like sin against bare skin. Lisa stood at the room's center in a gown of her own creation, midnight blue silk with silver threading that caught light with every breath, and smiled with the particular warmth of a woman holding a blade behind her back. "Lady Hartwick, how extraordinary to see you. I'd heard you were loyal to English suppliers, no matter how inferior their products." The barb landed precisely. Lady Hartwick's current gown was London-made, and the stitching showed it. She flushed, but couldn't retreat, not with 24 other women flowing through the doors behind her, their expressions cycling between contempt for Lisa's origins and hunger for the fabrics surrounding her. Lisa had choreographed the afternoon with the same ruthless precision she applied to contracts. She didn't apologize for her presence or explain her success. She simply demonstrated mastery. She discussed thread counts with technical fluency that made the merchant wives' daughters look ignorant. She explained dye processes in 3 languages, watching society ladies struggle to follow French phrases their governesses had never bothered teaching them. She held up 2 bolts of apparently identical cream silk and challenged them to identify which was English, then revealed the inferior weave structure that marked London's finest mills as provincial. "My suppliers in Lyon," she explained, her voice carrying effortless authority, have perfected techniques English weavers abandoned 50 years ago in favor of volume over artistry. The difference is apparent to anyone with discerning taste. The implication hung unspoken. If they couldn't see the difference, they had no taste. If they could see it, they'd admit Lisa was right. Lady Pemberton, the same Lady Pemberton whose musicale had hosted Lisa's destruction, reached for a length of rose silk with trembling fingers. "This color," she whispered. "I've never seen anything like it." "You won't," Lisa agreed pleasantly. "Not in England. I have exclusive contracts with the dye houses in Lyon. If you'd like this fabric for your daughter's presentation gown, I can arrange a special commission." She paused, letting the weight of that word settle. "For the right client. The right client." Meaning clients who'd acknowledge her, who'd treat her with the respect her expertise commanded, who'd pay premium prices to a woman they'd once dismissed as a duke's temporary indulgence. By the afternoon's end, Lisa had secured 17 commissions, established herself as the arbiter of London's textile taste, and forced every woman present to admit, through their orders if not their words, that the physician's daughter they delighted in destroying had become someone they desperately needed. She'd made them come to her, made them covet what she controlled, made them understand that she no longer required their approval to matter. As the last guests departed, Lady Hartwick paused at the threshold. "You've done remarkably well for yourself, Miss Otten." Lisa met her gaze without flinching. "I had excellent motivation, Lady Hartwick." Cruelty is remarkably clarifying. The Dowager Duchess of Borges arrived at Lisa's rented townhouse unannounced, sweeping through the entrance hall with the imperial certainty of a woman who'd never been refused entry anywhere. She didn't wait for the butler to announce her. She simply appeared in Lisa's drawing room like an avenging angel carved from ice and entitlement, her black silk rustling with barely contained fury. "You will leave London immediately," the Dowager announced without preamble. "Whatever scheme you've concocted to humiliate my son ends now." Lisa set down her teacup with deliberate care, taking a moment to appreciate the exquisite irony of this woman who'd orchestrated her destruction 6 years prior, standing in a drawing room Lisa paid for with money earned through her own brilliance. "Good afternoon, Your Grace. How unexpected. I don't recall extending an invitation." "Don't play the lady with me." The Dowager's voice could have frozen water. "I know exactly what you are. A grasping little nobody who spread her legs for a duke and now thinks that entitles her to consideration." Lisa had spent 6 years preparing for this moment. She'd imagined 100 versions of this confrontation, rehearsed responses ranging from dignified silence to verbal evisceration. But now, faced with the woman who'd whispered in Julius's ear until he'd chosen duty over love, she felt only a cold, clarifying calm. "How curious," Lisa said, rising to retrieve a leather portfolio from her desk. "I was told Your Grace possessed impeccable breeding. Yet here you stand in my drawing room, uninvited, hurling insults like a fishwife." She opened the portfolio with unhurried precision. "Shall we discuss what I am? I'm the woman whose textile company supplied fabrics for Lady Arabella Winthrop's trousseau. Fabrics your family ordered, fabrics your family has yet to pay for." The Dowager's face paled. "That's impossible. Our accounts are in arrears to the sum of £4,300. Lisa withdrew a ledger, its pages covered in meticulous entries. "Here, your son authorized the purchase 8 months ago for his intended bride. My company delivered the goods in good faith. Payment was due within 60 days. It's been 240. She laid the ledger on the side table between them like a challenge. The Dowager stared at it as if it were a serpent, her composure fracturing around the edges. "You ordered silk damask, Venetian velvet, French lace, Lisa continued, her voice carrying the pleasant detachment of someone reading a shopping list. Enough to outfit Lady Arabella for a duchess's wardrobe. Your solicitor assured my agent that payment would arrive promptly. It seems the Borgias family's word has depreciated along with its fortune. You scheming little creditor, Lisa finished calmly. The word you're searching for is creditor, Your Grace. And before you threaten scandal, consider this. I have documentation of every transaction, every promise, every default. If you attempt to resurrect old gossip about my relationship with your son, I'll present these ledgers to every merchant in London and explain precisely why the Borgias family can no longer secure credit anywhere in Europe. The silence that followed was absolute. The dowager stood frozen, her aristocratic mask finally cracking to reveal something raw underneath. Fear. You've destroyed us, the dowager whispered. No, Lisa corrected, sliding the ledger back into her portfolio. You destroyed yourselves through pride and incompetence. I simply refuse to subsidize your continued delusions of superiority. She moved toward the door, opening it in clear dismissal. My carriage can return you to Borgias House, unless, of course, you'd prefer to walk. I understand economizing is your family's new fashion. The Dowager Duchess left without another word, her spine rigid with the effort of maintaining dignity in retreat. Lisa closed the door and permitted herself one small, victorious smile. The woman who'd orchestrated her exile had just learned that exile could travel in both directions. Julius came to her townhouse 3 times in the week following his mother's defeat. The first time, Lisa refused to see him. The second, she left him waiting in the entrance hall for 40 minutes before sending word she'd been unexpectedly detained. The third time, she relented, not out of kindness, but because watching him beg held a certain aesthetic appeal she hadn't yet exhausted. He looked worse each visit. The careful aristocratic polish had worn thin, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. His cravat was tied with less precision, his coat showed creases that suggested he'd worn it 2 days running, and his eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone who'd stopped sleeping properly. She'd once found his disheveled morning appearances charming, back when they'd meant stolen nights and lazy dawn conversations. Now they simply meant his world was collapsing, and he knew it. You're enjoying this, he said without preamble when she finally received him in her study. Not the drawing room this time. She'd chosen the space deliberately, surrounded by ledgers and contracts that represented everything she'd built without him. I'm conducting business, Lisa corrected, not looking up from the correspondence she was reviewing. Whether you find my success enjoyable or devastating is immaterial to me. He crossed to her desk, and she caught the scent of him. Still the same sandalwood cologne, still capable of triggering muscle memory of how it felt against her skin. She crushed the response with the ease of long practice. Wanting him was a habit she'd broken years ago, like biting her nails or believing in fairy tales. Lisa, please. Look at me. She set down her pen with deliberate slowness, met his gaze with the blank professionalism she'd perfected in Lyon boardrooms. I am looking, Your Grace. I see a man whose family owes my company £4,000. I see a duke whose estates face foreclosure. I see someone who requires my assistance. What I don't see is anything that justifies intimacy. I was wrong. The words came out strangled. 6 years ago, at the Ashford Musicale, I was a coward. I chose my position over you, and I've regretted it every day since. How extraordinary, Lisa said, her voice carrying the kind of polite interest one might show toward mildly curious weather patterns. You've had over 2,000 days to communicate this regret, yet you only managed to articulate it once you needed my money. The timing is remarkable. Wouldn't you say? Julius flinched as though she'd struck him. Good. She wanted him to feel every word like a blade. It's not about the money, he insisted. and she almost laughed at the desperation in his voice. "I know you don't believe me, but I've thought about you constantly. The investments, the debts, they happened because I stopped caring what happened to the estate after I lost you. I sabotaged everything because nothing mattered anymore. So your financial ruin is somehow proof of devotion." Lisa leaned back in her chair, studying him with the detached curiosity of someone examining an interesting insect. "How romantic. You destroyed your family's legacy because you missed your mistress. Shall I applaud your dramatic gesture, or simply point out that nobility requires more than pretty suffering?" "What do you want from me?" The question broke from him like a confession. "Tell me what I need to do. Tell me how to prove I'm not the man who betrayed you." Lisa stood, moved to the window so she wouldn't have to watch his face crumble. Outside, London continued its indifferent dance. Carriages rolling past, merchants calling their wares, the world turning without regard for anyone's heartbreak. She'd learned that lesson thoroughly. "I want you to leave," she said quietly. "And I want you to understand that your remorse, however genuine, doesn't obligate me to absolve you. You chose your comfort over my dignity. Now I'm choosing mine over your redemption." She heard him move toward the door, heard his hand on the handle, heard the moment his control finally shattered. "I loved you," Julius whispered. "I still love you." Lisa turned, and her smile was kind in a way that made it crueler than contempt. "Then you finally learned what it feels like to love someone who can't afford to love you back." The opera house glittered with the particular cruelty of London society at its most performative. Lisa had chosen her box deliberately, third tier, stage left, visible to everyone who mattered. She wore emerald silk that cost more than most families earned in a year, and diamonds at her throat that had once belonged to a French countess desperate to pay gambling debts. She looked, she knew, like money, like power, like everything Julius had sacrificed her to preserve, now wrapped around a woman he no longer had any right to touch. She'd been prepared for whispers. She'd been prepared for calculated snubs, for dowagers turning their backs, for the particular theatre of aristocratic disapproval. She hadn't been prepared for Lady Arabella Winthrop to make a spectacle of possession. It happened during the second intermission. Lisa had been accepting polite conversation from Lord Hartwick, whose wife had ordered 6 bolts of her Venetian velvet, when the murmur swept through the crowd like wind through wheat. She turned to see Lady Arabella entering the Duke of Borges's box, her hand proprietary on Julius's arm, her smile radiant with the triumph of a woman staking public claim. Arabella was beautiful in the way society rewarded, pale, delicate, her family tree unblemished by anyone who'd ever worked for wages. She wore the £4,000 trousseau fabrics Lisa's company had delivered, the ones the Borges family still hadn't paid for. The irony was so perfect it should have been funny. Instead, it felt like swallowing glass. Julius looked up, and his gaze found Lisa's across the crowded theatre with the unerring accuracy of someone who'd spent weeks searching for her in every room. She watched his face shift through a catalogue of emotions, longing, shame, resignation, before Arabella leaned close to whisper something that made him turn away. The message was clear. He belonged to someone else, someone suitable, someone whose father owned half of Yorkshire and whose mother could trace lineage to the conqueror, someone who'd never been foolish enough to love a duke for his mind rather than his title. Lisa stood, intending to retreat to the lobby, but Arabella's voice carried across the intervening space with perfect calculated clarity. "Poor Miss Otten. How awkward this must be for her. I do hope she understands that Julius's unfortunate past is precisely that, past. We're all so pleased he's moved beyond his youthful indiscretions." The words landed like a gauntlet. Every eye in the vicinity turned to Lisa, waiting to see if she'd crumble or flee or provide the evening's entertainment through some vulgar display of emotion. Lisa felt something cold and clarifying settle in her chest. Not heartbreak. She'd survived that years ago. Not rage. That was too reactive, too raw. What she felt was pure, crystalline understanding. She didn't want Julius back. She'd never wanted him back. What she'd wanted was for him to understand the cost of his cowardice, to feel what she'd felt, to know that loving someone wasn't enough when it came without courage. But watching Arabella's possessive hand on his arm, seeing the future he'd chosen arrayed before her in silk and smugness, Lisa realized something sharper. She didn't just want him to understand, she wanted him to choose, to stand in the crucible of public judgment and make a different decision than he'd made 6 years ago. She wanted proof that he'd learned what love actually required. Lisa descended to the Duke's box with measured steps, every eye tracking her movement. She stopped at the entrance, met Arabella's triumphant gaze with perfect calm, then looked at Julius. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Your solicitor mentioned you required a business meeting. I'm available tomorrow at 10. Do come alone." Then she walked away, leaving Arabella's triumph curdling into confusion, and Julius staring after her with something that looked dangerously like hope. The Pemberton Ball achieved its full glory by 11. 300 guests arrayed beneath chandeliers that turned the ballroom into captured starlight. Orchestras playing in perfect rotation, champagne flowing with the calculated excess that marked the season's pinnacle. Lisa stood at the room's edge in her golden gown, watching the dance of London society with the detached interest of someone who'd learned its patterns from the outside before mastering them from within. She'd known Julius would come. She'd planned for it, actually, timed her arrival for maximum visibility, positioned herself where he'd have to cross the entire ballroom to reach her, ensured that every person who'd witnessed her destruction 6 years ago would have front-row seats to whatever came next. He appeared at midnight, moving through the crowd with the desperate focus of someone who'd run out of alternatives. His evening dress was impeccable, his mother's influence probably, one last attempt at maintaining appearances. But his face told the truth his clothes tried to hide. He looked like a man standing at the edge of an abyss, calculating whether the fall would kill him. The crowd sensed something coming. Conversations slowed, dancers lost their rhythm, faces turned toward the Duke of Borges, crossing the floor toward the woman he'd once called a regrettable lapse in judgment. Lisa watched him approach and felt nothing but a cold, steady curiosity about what desperation would make him do. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough for private conversation if he'd wanted it. He didn't want it. "Miss Otten," he said, and his voice carried across the sudden, breathless silence. "I owe you an apology, not privately, not quietly, but here, before everyone who watched me fail you." The ballroom held its collective breath. 300 people waiting to see if a duke would actually abase himself before a merchant's daughter, if pride could finally be sacrificed on the altar of genuine remorse. Julius sank to his knees. The gesture shattered every rule of conduct London society held sacred. Dukes didn't kneel to anyone except royalty, certainly not to women they'd discarded, certainly not in public, before witnesses who'd spread the story across England by morning. 6 years ago, Julius continued, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, I chose my position over your dignity. I called you a lapse in judgment when you were the only honest thing in my life. I let my mother's ambition and my own cowardice destroy the woman I loved, and I have spent every day since learning what it means to live without integrity. Lady Arabella stood frozen across the ballroom, her face white with the understanding that her carefully secured engagement had just become ashes. The Dowager Duchess gripped a champagne flute so hard Lisa heard the crystal crack from 15 feet away. "I'm not asking you to save my estate," Julius said. and tears tracked down his face without shame. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let me spend whatever years I have left proving I've learned what love requires. That it requires courage. That it requires choosing the person over the position, every time, without exception." He reached into his coat, withdrew a folded document, held it up for the entire room to see. "This is the deed to Thornfield Lodge, the place where we were happiest. It's yours, not as payment, not as negotiation, as proof that some things matter more than inheritance." Lisa looked down at the man who'd destroyed her, now kneeling in the ruins of his own pride, offering her the one piece of his life he'd actually chosen rather than inherited. She saw genuine remorse in his eyes, genuine transformation. She also saw 300 witnesses who'd laughed at her humiliation, who'd struck her from every guest list, who'd taught her that society's mercy was conditional and its cruelty was absolute. "Stand up," she said quietly, and the entire ballroom leaned forward to hear. "I won't have you grovel. I've never wanted that." Julius stood, hope and fear warring across his features. Lisa took one step closer, her voice carrying with perfect clarity to every corner of the room. "You're right that you owe me an apology, but you owe yourself something more important. Proof that you're capable of keeping the promises you make in moments of desperation." Lisa held Julius's gaze for a long moment, aware that 300 people were holding their breath, waiting for her to choose mercy or vengeance, reconciliation or destruction. She'd spent 6 years imagining this moment, the satisfaction of watching him beg, the sweetness of refusing him, the theatrical perfection of his public humiliation. Now that it had arrived, she felt only a strange, clarifying emptiness where rage should have lived. "I don't forgive you," she said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom with the authority she'd earned in Lyon, counting rooms, and Amsterdam negotiations. Forgiveness requires trust, and trust requires proof, not promises made in desperation. Julius's face crumbled, but she held up one hand to forestall his response. "However," Lisa continued, "I won't grant you the martyr's crown of my permanent refusal either. Revenge, I've learned, is far less satisfying than becoming someone who doesn't require it." She withdrew an envelope from her reticule, held it where the entire assembly could witness the exchange. "This is a contract. Read it carefully before you sign." Julius took it with trembling hands, broke the seal, scanned the contents. His eyes widened. "I'm proposing a partnership," Lisa explained, addressing not just Julius but the entire room, every society matron who'd delighted in her exile, every gentleman who'd watched her destruction with champagne in hand. "The Borgias estate requires £30,000 to avoid foreclosure. My company will provide that capital, not as a gift, not as reconciliation, but as investment in a textile operation to be established on the northern lands currently lying fallow." She watched understanding dawn across Julius's features, watched him realize she wasn't offering salvation, but transformation. "You'll manage the operation," Lisa continued. "You'll learn textile production from foundation to finish. You'll work alongside weavers and dyers and merchants who've spent their lives building expertise you've never bothered to value. And every quarter you'll provide detailed accounting to my company. Not to me personally, but to my business managers who'll evaluate your performance without sentiment." "For how long?" Julius asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years, Lisa said, and the symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. 3 years he'd loved her in secret. 3 years he'd prove whether he'd learned what honor required. If, at the end of that period, you've demonstrated genuine transformation through actions, not words, we'll revisit the question of what relationship, if any, we might attempt. She turned to face the assembled crowd, her voice rising with the confidence of someone who'd learned that power came not from others' approval, but from one's own conviction. I'm also announcing the establishment of the Otten Foundation for Women's Enterprise. Half of my company's annual profits will fund business education and capital for women of modest birth who possess talent but lack opportunity. Women like I was 6 years ago, told their origins defined their worth, their ambitions were inappropriate. Their minds were less valuable than their matrimonial prospects. The ballroom erupted in whispers, shock, admiration, outrage cycling through the crowd like weather patterns. Lisa didn't care. She'd stopped caring what London society thought the moment she'd boarded the Channel ferry with £43 and a broken heart. The Foundation's first beneficiary, Lisa continued, meeting the Dowager Duchess's furious gaze with perfect calm, will be Lady Arabella Winthrop, should she choose to accept. I understand her engagement has just concluded rather dramatically. She'll need education in financial independence, as I suspect the Borges family can no longer afford the settlement they promised her father. Lady Arabella's face went through several shades of humiliation before settling on something that looked almost like grudging respect. The Dowager looked apoplectic. Lisa turned back to Julius, who still held the contract with reverent care, as if it were scripture rather than terms of business. 3 years, she repeated softly, meant only for him now. Prove you're the man you claim to be in that garden at Thornfield. Prove you can choose principle over position when there's no audience demanding it. Prove you've learned that love without courage is just comfortable cowardice. Julius met her eyes, and she saw genuine understanding there, not the desperate hope of someone seeking rescue, but the solemn determination of someone accepting consequence. "And if I fail?" he asked. Lisa smiled, and it held no cruelty, only honesty. "Then you'll have built something meaningful anyway, and I'll have the satisfaction of knowing I gave you more grace than you gave me." She turned and walked toward the ballroom doors, her golden gown catching light with each step, leaving Julius kneeling with her terms in his hands and 300 witnesses to the fact that Lisa J. Otten had transformed her pain into something larger than revenge. She'd transformed it into possibility,